Hi y'all. I had someone reach out to me over email recently, and they were essentially asking, how do I back up a data table to a physical file? Now, this person was upfront with me, said that they weren't as experienced, but nonetheless was still asking for some help. So I figured I'd cut a video on how this could be done using Visual Basic. Now, the original idea was for this person to store the data table in a text file. And as you'll see later on in this video, it's actually a lot easier to leverage the built-in methods that the .NET framework provides to write to an XML document. And it's not very difficult to decipher either. You don't have to be an XML expert to understand what's going on in the XML file. Now, as you can see, I have a form laid out. It's a simple form. It has two buttons, a load and a backup, and then a data grid view. And I'm going to show you a window here that some of y'all may not be familiar with. If you go to View and then Server Explorer, you'll see I already have a data table created, but this is where you would find all of your, well, not all of your, but some of your databases. If it was hosted on a server, it'd be listed here. In this particular case, it's just a local database file, a .mdf file, and I've named it test, and it has one table called friend. If I go in here and show the table data, you'll see that it has a couple rows, John Smith and Jane Doe, and they have emails and phone numbers, which are all bogus. So first thing that we're going to do, we're going to go ahead and try to load the data that I just showed you into this data grid view. So we're going to go ahead and generate the click event, which if you don't know what I did, I simply double clicked on the button in the designer. An alternative would be to bring up the properties, go to the events, which I'm not able to do because my game bar is behind it. Here we go. And double click on the load here. In here, what we'll be doing is a couple of things. We will be first creating a data connection. Second, we will be creating a data command. And then finally, we will be creating a data adapter. But before all of this begins, we have to declare a data table at the form level because we will be using it in our other button, this button back up here. So I'm going to go ahead and declare a private variable. And declare its type as a data table. And in my button load event, I'm going to go ahead and start declaring these various objects. So every single one of these, because they implement iDisposable, you'll want to go ahead and create them using the declare them using the using statements. So I'm calling as SQL client dot SQL connection. We're going to create a new instance of that. Now, if you're not familiar with what your connection string is, a simple way to find it would be to simply right-click on the database in the Server Explorer, click on Properties, and you'll see it shows up right here. So I'm just going to take this connection string and plug it in right there. Once we have the connection created, we're going to go ahead and declare the command. And we'll create a new instance of that. And in this case, we're wanting to pull everything from our friend table. At this point, we're not going to quite create the data adapter, because what we need to do, now that we've created the connection and set up our command, we need to actually open up the connection in order for us to connect to the database. And now we're going to go ahead and, oops, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, I apologize. So one of the overloads for the SQL command is not only to pass in your command string, but to also pass in the connection that is associated with it. So we'll go ahead and do that there as well. So now we're going to go ahead and create our data adapter, and this is what's actually going to populate the data from the database into our data table. And we're going to create a new instance of it. And we're going to pass the command that we declared right here. Now, in all of this, what we are going to do is we are going to load via the load method. So if you call adapter.load, or fill, I apologize, adapter.fill, and then pass in your data table, this will fill in the friend data table with all of the data from the friend table outlined in the database. And finally, once all that's said and done, we're going to go ahead and close the connection back out, which is always good practice to do. So I'm going to go ahead and blow away these comments. And down here, assuming that nothing fails, we're going to check that the data table is not nothing. And if it is something, then we're going to go ahead and set the data source of our data table, our data grid view. So let's go ahead and test this out. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is click load. And you will see that, okay, so this exception is telling me that it cannot load the or fill in the data table because the data table is set to nothing right now. So I'm going to go ahead and stop execution and fix this issue. And what we will do right here is do friends data table equals a new instance of a data table, and we're going to go ahead and pass in a name because the name from the data table here does not get passed in to the data table whenever you call adapter.fill. And this is actually very important whenever we go to back up the data table. So let's go ahead and try this again. Call load, and there we go. So the data is now populated in the data grid view. So now what we're going to go ahead and do is generate the click event for the backup button. And this is really the meat and potatoes of what the person who reached out to me, what their request was. And so there are a couple of things that we will be doing in this section. First, we'll want to check that the data table is not nothing, because what someone could do is start the application, try to click back up, and if we had code that relied on the data table being populated, then it could error out. So we'll set up that condition. Go ahead and add our conditional statement and display an error message. And just to show that that's working, we're going to assume that same scenario where someone just goes in, completely ignores the load, and just clicks on backup. Here you go. You see, please load the data table before backing it up. So once we have this conditional check in place, what we're going to do, this particular person wanted to use a save file dialog. I think that's probably a good practice in this situation since we are using a Windows Form application after all. So we're going to go ahead and use create a new instance of a save file dialog. Just like these objects up here, save file dialog also implements iDisposable, so it's good practice to go ahead and declare that using a using statement. And a shorthand in Visual Basic.NET that's not available in C# is the width. I don't even know what that is called. I'll just reference as a width keyword. Basically what it does is whenever we do something like this where we set the properties, so let's go ahead and do file name equals nothing, or actually we'll set the filter since we know that we're going to be exporting it to XML. Set the initial directory to, let's go ahead and set it to my documents. What this does here, this acts as a shorthand as I'm not going to go ahead and type it out, but it prevents us from having to prefix it with sfd dot every single time. So let's see, we'll go ahead and set the title as well. So what we've done so far is we've created a new instance of a save file dialog. We've gone ahead and set a couple of properties. We've set the filter to only accept saving XML documents. The initial directory is going to be my documents, and then the title will be backup directory. The way that a save file dialog works is that it returns a dialog result, and since we will be using the built-in save file dialog, we'll always check if it returns OK. So go ahead and set up a conditional statement that checks if show dialog equals OK. We're not going to worry about the else because we really don't want to handle if the user cancels out. I mean, you probably could put message box that show you canceled the operation, but that's really redundant and unnecessary. So once we've gotten to this point, the user has populated the data table from the load. They have opened the save file dialog, and they have selected a file that they want to go ahead and create or overwrite. Now the next step will be to actually save the XML. And we do this by calling the writeXML method on the data table. So friend datatable.writeXML, and we're going to pass in the file name from our save file dialog, and then we will also do this important overload called, let's see, I have to check through IntelliSense here, XML write mode, that's what I'm looking for. So write schema. What this does, we theoretically we could just do this here, where we just wrote the XML to this path, and what that would do is it would write just the records and their values, and it stores it as an XML, which is essentially a text file. It's markup on a text file, and this is not very useful on its own because what if we have data types that are not string values? So for example, if you take a look at my data table here, we have friend ID, which is an int value. We may have some other, I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but some other thing that accepts a non-string data type as its column, and we want to know what that column actually represents. By including this additional overload here, this write schema, we're essentially telling the data table to save not only the records, but also how those records are represented in the data table. But once you call write schema, that's it. It actually writes the XML to the file. But because we're debugging, I'm going to go ahead and also print to the console what actually gets represented. So let's go ahead and run this. So just show you, try to hit back up. It's saying no, please load the data table first. So we load it. Now we're going to do backup. It's going to launch the save file dialog. Just going to type in something, test.xml, and it went ahead and saved the data. And the data that gets saved, which we have printed to the console, is this here. So you see we have our schema defined up at this top little block here. And what this is saying is that we have 5 different columns. The last 4 columns are all strings. The first column is an int. And then we have our records. So this one friend node represents one friend record. And in this case, you can see John Smith and then his information, and then Jane Doe and all of her information. If we had more, they would just continue to repeat until we ran out of data. But that's pretty much it. I wanted to go ahead and recap real quick what we did. So from our Server Explorer, which we got from View, Server Explorer, we have a data table here with a database with a data table. We were able to get the connection string from the properties. We created a form level variable for our data table that represents the friend data table in our database. In our button load, we created a new instance of the connection, a new instance of the command. We passed in the command string, which in this case is select all from the friend table, while also passing our connection declared above. We opened up the connection and then created a data adapter, which in turn we created a new instance of the data table and filled the data from the database to that data table. And finally, at this last little bit, just for visual representation, we set the data grid view, its data source, to the data table. Now in our backup, we checked if the form level variable for our data table is not nothing, and if it is nothing, then we just display the simple error message. But if it's not nothing, we go ahead and create a new save file dialog. We specify that they can only save it as XML. We show the dialog, and if they click OK to save it, then it writes the XML to the file name specified in that save file dialog, and we also include the schema with it. And for debugging purposes, we have this console write line to print out what was actually written to that file. But that's pretty much it. I hope you got something from this, and if y'all want me to create more of these videos, please let me know, and I'll be happy to do so.